There we go. The title, as you see from the program, is a 40-year perspective on the past, a look forward. I picked 40 years because in 1975, I first taught a course at Stanford University on the World Food Program. It was a course that had a long history at Stanford. Merrill Bennett had taught it, Bruce Johnston had taught it, but Bruce was on sabbatical, and I was asked if I would step in as a young faculty and teach a course on the world food economy. So that's the starting point for what I consider my own sort of serious deliberation, serious thinking, serious analysis of how the world food economy works and what goes wrong with it. 1975, some of you in the room are old enough to remember that we were just winding down a very serious world food crisis. It started with rice in Asia in late 1972 and spread very quickly to maize and wheat right around the world. And the world food crisis corresponded also with an energy crisis, the formation of OPEC, restriction of oil supplies, and what we had was a commodity boom that really changed how people in the world were thinking, not just about whether food was going to be available, but the linkages between energy and food going forward. So the question is, what has changed? We got PowerPoint. We're good. We're getting there. So what has changed in those 40 years? The bottom line of that question will be a conclusion that ending hunger has turned out to be a very difficult task. Some of you will remember Henry Kissinger stating in 1976 that within a decade, no child would go to bed hungry. No one would have to worry about having enough food on the table. There would be no hunger within a decade. We failed miserably in that promise, and the question then is why? Oh, here we go. Okay, let me come over here. Let me do this. Oh, I can do it from here now. Okay, I can see. You can hear me okay now? It's easier if I stand here and look at the screen from here rather than walk up and down in front of you. So here's the set of questions. What's changed? There's some personal landmarks. A 2-volume issue of Food Research Institute Studies was published in 1975 on the political economy of rice in Asia. I had done the chapter on Indonesia for that volume. Professor Amar Siamwala had done the chapter on Thailand. Professor Amar and I go back a long way, and I'll just take the opportunity right now. Thank you, Amar, for inviting me to this. It's a great honor for me. I am delighted. A book titled Food Policy Analysis that Wally Falcon and Scott Pearson and I wrote was published in 1983. Amazingly, it is still used in courses on the world food economy and on food policy, even though it's more than 30 years old, and I have to say, it's dated in pretty serious ways. On the other hand, the framework that was laid out for thinking about food issues in the context of trade, macroeconomics, and household decision-making, but integrating all of those components, I think the 1983 book was really the first time we were able to pull all of that together for the profession. In 1988, I published a chapter on the agricultural transformation. It was a growing sense of mine that we couldn't understand what was happening in terms of agricultural development and then how agricultural production fed out into the world food economy. We could not understand that without understanding what happens to agriculture during the process of economic growth. And equally important, what is the role of agriculture in stimulating that economic growth? This is a two-way relationship And you have to think about both directions. But you can't do one or just the other. Both of them are important. And then in 2009, I published a little monograph for the American Enterprise Institute called A World Without Agriculture, the structural transformation in historical perspective, looking at the end point of the economic growth process in terms of where agriculture fit in rich countries. And the simple answer is there are more lawyers in the United States than there are farmers. There are more dry cleaning establishments in the United States than there are farm establishments. If you want to think about the share of agriculture in the economy going to very small proportion, in rich countries, agriculture is less than 1 or 2% of both the workforce and its contribution to GDP. But in all rich countries, agriculture is more productive, producing more output than it ever did. It seems like a paradox that the success of agriculture in expanding output ends up making it less important to policy, to the economy, and whatever. So, given that history, I come to today, but come to the conclusion after studying this whole historical process and being involved for 40 years with the question, why is ending hunger so hard? That's our agenda, after all. I mean, basically what we're trying to do, if we're interested in food and agriculture, we are trying to figure out a way to reduce poverty and to end hunger. Everything else is a means to that end. The world community just committed itself at the Sustainable Development Goals meeting in October at the UN to ending poverty and hunger in the next 15 years, to do it by 2030. So the question is, well, why didn't similar pledges over the last 40 or 50 years result in that outcome? And what are the hopes of making that promise actually come true? There's actually a book. Just came out this year, Food Security and Scarcity. The subtitle is Why Ending Hunger is So Hard. So I simply had to put it up so that you could see that it exists. And much of what I want to talk about today is summarizing what is in the book. It focuses on 4 main themes. Complex role of markets. I don't want to say capitalism as a system. I want us to focus on the role of markets in the economy, because we may have to distinguish between the institutional framework in which these markets are set and the role that the markets themselves have to play. Secondly, though, the importance of government policies. I learned about development when I first went to Indonesia, my PhD still hot in my hand, in 1970. My first appointment was as a junior advisor for the Harvard Advisory Group. My PhD was at Harvard, so I knew the people there. And my first appointment was in the National Planning Agency. I had never taken a course in development. I'm an economic historian by training, but I had studied commodity markets for 2 years on Wall Street, and I certainly did have a sense of how commodity markets work. And at the time, of course, Indonesia was a major commodity exporter. So there was need for some expertise on how world markets work for the things that Indonesia exported. But you can't sit in a national planning agency and think, oh, government policy is irrelevant. That's simply not the mindset. I was there for 2 years and then back every 2 or 3 times a year for the next 40 years, and I am conditioned to think that it's important that the government do the right thing. That's the role of food policy analysis, but the role of government is really, really important in this. Markets may do a lot of the work, but governments have to intervene as well. Third topic is the historical process of structural transformation that I've highlighted. That has been, in some sense, my major academic role. I was a professor at Harvard for many years, Stanford and Cornell before that, and then, as was noted, went to the University of California, San Diego to be a dean, which didn't work out very well. I'm not a dean. I'm a researcher and an advisor, but I'm not a very good dean. But understanding this whole historical process of structural transformation, the role of agriculture in that. I am a product of Alexander Gerschenkron. Did you do Gerschenkron? Economic backwardness in historical perspective. And he thought agriculture was part of the problem in the development process. It was backward. It had people who weren't educated. You couldn't get them into the factories to work on time. Agriculture was the problem. And industrialization, the faster the better, was the solution to modernization. He focused almost entirely his work on the European experience, but I was molded by that introduction to the historical process of thinking about the problems that come up as much as opportunities for substituting other ways of solving a problem, as much as, oh, well, there's a constraint, then you can't do anything. The European experience was, here's a constraint, oh, well, we'll do it some other way than the way the British did it. The Germans will do it differently than the French did it, but it's still attacking the same basic structural transformation problem. Finally, I'll end today talking about the need to identify the appropriate time horizon for analysis and interventions. With all due respect to our opening speaker, to the Deputy Prime Minister, it is, I think we all understand, extremely difficult to get policymakers and politicians to focus on anything other than the short-run realities that they are coping with. 5 years out is an eternity. 50 years out might as well be zero interest. You can't even begin to think about that. I'm going to show you a picture of the structural transformation in Japan and Indonesia with the data starting in 1880 and going to 2010. 130 years of economic development and structural transformation, and they aren't done yet. This is a long-run process, and I think policymakers need to have that, I'll call it a strategic framework, in their head and in front of their analysts. Now, these four themes they're not new, but I think getting them into a coherent approach to ending hunger is, I think, the contribution of the book. But it's the integration of these four things that's really hard. It's conceptually difficult, it's operationally difficult, and I think we all understand it is politically difficult. I won't try to speak on the realities of policymaking in Thailand, but I can tell you that in Indonesia we have a very, very difficult time getting the parliament to deal with anything other than extremely short-run features. In the United States, we don't take policy seriously any longer at all. Did anybody watch the Republican debate? I mean, it's just the disconnect from what I would call reality in the United States political scene is just astonishing. So this is going to be hard because it's going to require that we get policy right. It's going to require that we do the analysis and inform policy choices. Now, the rich countries are lucky because they've got enough resources that you can do this even if you don't get things completely right. There's plenty of slack in the economy so that we still have some, but there's no need for that. That's just a programmatic issue. It is not a development and policy issue or development issue. But for poor countries that have managed to end hunger while they were still poor, Most of those examples are here in Asia, Southeast Asia, and China. And the lessons from those success stories in this region drive the analysis in the book, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. I should probably put my watch out. What time do I need to stop? 10:15? Okay. I'm good. So, why is ending hunger so hard? I'm not going to try to ad-lib this. I've really worked hard at crafting the words in this short message. So if you'll let me, I'm just going to read the 4 sentences. Ending hunger is hard because it is a lengthy process that requires sustained policy attention and public resources. At the same time that private markets are the main arena for nearly all the decisions that matter. Public policy, private markets. The food system is at the core of this process in both the long run and the short run. In the long run, the food system is a key element of the structural transformation, which historically has been the only sustainable pathway out of poverty. Let me emphasize that. The structural transformation has been the only sustainable pathway out of poverty. You have to get people from very tiny, low productivity jobs in small farms to better jobs, often in rural areas, but sometimes in the non-farm economy. The structural transformation that changes the relationship of the labor force and the economy between agriculture and the rest urban areas, the structural transformation, where that works, that's been the only successful way out of poverty, and where it has not worked, we'll look shortly, where it has not worked, we have not been able to end poverty. In the short run, the food system is where many of the poor make their living and also face the risks of volatile food prices. Now, those food prices may be caused by bad weather or whatever, but being a small farmer is a very risky undertaking. My main message, Peter Warr here will appreciate, this is an Australian term, the wicked problem. The Australians coined the term to deal with climate change because it's so complicated that no single individual, no single discipline, no single school, no single think tank can figure it out. It's just much, much too complicated. That's what a wicked problem is. And I think there's growing acceptance that food security is a wicked problem. It is a very, very complex thing to pull off. First of all, markets, to solve the problem of food insecurity, markets have to do the heavy lifting. Markets have to be the arena in which virtually every decision that matters is going to get made. There are 3 things markets have to do. There are engineering functions. They have to move inputs and outputs from the farm through the processing sector into retail, transforming the product in time, in place, and form. And I don't care whether you're the Soviet Union or North Korea or any kind of socialist planned economy. You still have to do this. I was in China in 1975. There was total denial by the Maoists at the time that markets did anything. But China moved its grain, its vegetables, its livestock products in time, place, and form. They transformed them. They actually had to do all of these functions. Now, the question is, how do you do them efficiently? That was not a question that the Chinese were asking from the point of view of an economist. They were asking it from the point of view of an engineer, a planner, in that sense. But if you do these tasks efficiently, transportation, storage, processing, if you do them efficiently, the marketing sector becomes the arena for price discovery, because the different prices at each stage in the marketing chain have to match the costs of creating the value added of milling the rice or moving from farm gate to warehouse, or storing it from the harvest season to the short season. Each of those costs real economic resources. Each one of those tasks takes real economic resources. And what we want for efficiency is the cost of doing those tasks gets matched with the price differentials, so that the people who will do this sort of automatically know, oh, I can make a little profit if I can move the rice from West Java to Jakarta. So the marketing system then becomes the locus for price discovery and for efficient exchange of commodities. These commodities, each time this happens, typically they change hands. Increasingly, with modern supply chains and supermarkets at the end, there may be a single ownership pattern all the way back to the farm, although the farm is usually not part of that. But in more traditional marketing systems, the commodity changes hands. There has to be an agreement on the terms of the exchange. All of this sounds busy, doesn't it? There must be 10 billion of those transactions every single day. Oh. Bapanas can't plan that. Planning agencies can't do that. You need to get the price discovery and the exchange, the efficient exchange, working almost automatically, so that governments don't have to do this. The market does it. It's a critical role for the market is this discovery of prices that lead to efficient exchange. And when those prices then are out and visible, transparent if you like, then they provide signals to producers and to consumers for efficient resource allocation. If the price is high, you want farmers to be investing more in increasing output. You want consumers to look for substitutes for rice, wheat or cassava or corn. That's what responding to these price signals is all about. And when those responses are reasonably flexible, you get efficient resource allocation, and it is simply impossible to sustain poverty reduction without using our resources reasonably efficiently. I am not a Chicago economist that insists that this all has to be perfect, but we have to make these markets work pretty well, because we need those billions of transactions done every day automatically, and they've got to point the economy in the right direction instead of the wrong direction. Governments have to do the right things, and they have to stop doing the wrong things. I hope you all agree with that. The problem, of course, what's right? What's wrong? If I really had been trained in Chicago, I might be able to give you a fairly simple answer to that, but I wasn't. What's right and what's wrong varies by country, by stage of development. It changes over time, and it requires continuous policy analysis, and it requires pretty significant flexibility on the part of policymakers. We heard about knowledge-based learning in the policy process. That's exactly what we have to have. Because as circumstances change, policies will have to change, and you have to know what's going on in order to bring informed analysis to the debate. So, now, the bottom line, unfortunately, or depends on your point of view. I know we're co-sponsored by the Policy Society organization. The bottom line of this is that the political economy of this is really tricky, because we need policymakers to understand what's going on in the markets. And when things are going badly for income distribution, for economic growth, for stability, all of which the market doesn't really care about, when those are not working on behalf of the welfare of citizens, but they need to do the right thing and not do the wrong thing. And just the political economy is really, really difficult. Okay, that's my introduction. How many? Oh, I'm doing okay. Let's be sure we know what we're talking about. This is a food security lecture. I think of food security as having three basic pillars, columns if you like, and I think those pillars sit on one base and have a top, call them platforms if you like. Most of you will know the pillars. These are now well received in the food security literature and debates. You can't have food security unless the food is available. So availability of food is one of the pillars. It depends on food production, plus imports, minus exports. Obviously there can be waste and losses in storage and stuff like that. But the basic point, I think, is important. Please understand that the availability pillar is not just food production. Trade is an important component for almost every country in the world in being able to achieve food security. So it's very important that we keep that trade option. But it's also true that the Earth as a planet is a closed system. We can't trade with the moon or with Mars. So in a global sense, production really does determine availability. In the very short run, we can worry about how large food reserves are, a topic I've spent a whole lot of my career worrying about. But over the longer run, production, you can't consume the food unless you produce it. Second pillar is access to food. It took quite a while. It took really until the food crisis in the 1970s for the profession to really understand that food security is anything more than production and reserves. Well, there was plenty of food in the world. The book Food Policy Analysis, the 1983 book, starts out by doing the caloric conversion of the major grains and root and tubers, the protein crops. Didn't even look at meat, just did the calorie and protein conversions, added up, divide by the world's population, and you've got about a 30% surplus in terms of any meaningful requirements of the human for nutrient intake. Obviously, access, what Amartya Sen would call entitlement mechanisms. Access is at least as important in determining who is food secure and who is not. Indeed, I think this whole access question has sort of set up a dichotomy between a Malthusian view of the world, where population is going to grow so fast against a fixed resource base that famines will be the mechanism by which we keep population under control, versus what I will call a Senian view of the world, which is there's plenty of food out there. If we're going to solve the problem of food insecurity, we're going to have to figure out ways for households who do not have that access to get it. That can be public action. It can be getting them a good job. It can be just straight food distribution schemes from the World Food Program. I mean, there's a lot of different ways you can think about it, but making sure that poor households have access to food is critical. And certainly the recent experience, last 50 years, has been that we have enough on the availability side, and access is really a serious constraint in solving this problem. Those three pillars sit on two platforms, one on top and the bottom if you want. Increasingly now, the international community that deals with food security understands that stability of this whole food security system is critical. It doesn't work for poor households to have access to food over the average of a year or 5 years if there are spikes and shortages, because you really pretty much need food every day or on a regular basis. And so stability is a real issue. Most of the profession focuses on the stability at the availability side, making sure that droughts and typhoons don't destroy the food that is necessary to go into the market. But access is equally important, because things can happen in terms of the incomes, or, if you like, entitlement mechanisms of poor households, so that even when the food is in the market, if they lose their job, they lose their ability to access what food there is, then they're simply not food secure. And, following on the Paris meetings, but this has now been under discussion in a pretty serious way for a decade or more, the other platform is the sustainability of this system. And again, there are two dimensions that we think of. Sustainability is usually thought of as an agroecological concern, making sure that we don't mine our agricultural resources, our soils, and our water in a way that in 10 years they're gone and you can't continue to produce. But we need also to think about ways of sustaining the incomes of the poor, and the poor often rely heavily on exactly those resources. So this is going to be a fairly tricky debate going forward. So with that definition, we need to understand that there are three different levels at which we have to understand food security. We measure food security at the household level. Ideally, we would always be doing food security at the individual level, because it's individuals that matter, in fact. But the data are often not available. Usually what we have is, here's how much food is available in the household, here's the composition and size of the household, and we do the appropriate adjustments and try to figure out what's going on. But this is where we measure food insecurity. It's at the household level. I think of it as the micro level. That's, once a lot of the food security community stops at that point and says, okay, let's make sure we know what's going on at the household level, see how the trends are changing, and understand the characteristics of the households that have enough food and the characteristics of the ones that do not have enough food. End of story. We'll deal with the problem at that level. The difficulty with that is there is a food security issue that shows up at the national level. It's what I will call the macro side of food security. And it's the food security that policymakers worry about. They worry about whether urban markets have adequate food supplies at reasonably stable prices for the key foodstuffs. Think rice in the key capital cities of Asia. Food security for policymakers is knowing that those markets have adequate supplies and that the prices are reasonably stable. Why? Because urban households do not have the option of growing their own food. They have to go to the market. And even though they may be reasonably wealthy, if the market supplies disappear, if suddenly there is a scare, as there was in 2007 and 2008, if rice suddenly disappears from the shelves in the marketplace, you've got a really serious problem on your hand, even if there's enough rice out there. We even had rice scares in California in 2008. People started going to the major supermarkets and buying the rice right off the shelf because they were afraid there wasn't going to be rice next week or the week after that, and they wanted to be sure they got it. What's the surest thing that will happen if everybody panics? There will not be any rice on the shelves. It's just guaranteed. I think it is entirely appropriate for policymakers at the national level to take this issue really seriously. That's partly where history has made it very clear that if you can't keep rice in the market at stable prices, you will not be the government going forward, whether it's elected or whether it's military. You can't keep the trust of the people, And without the trust of the people, you simply can't govern. It's just as simple as that. But beyond this, there's actually a third level, the global level. As I said, we can't import and export. At the national level, if you're running low on rice stocks in Indonesia, you can come to Thailand and get some rice. But globally, if we're running out of rice, reserves all around the world, different countries have been exhausted. There's no place to go. So we have to maintain the production capability at a global level that ensures that the supplies we will need at the national level, which then will go down to the household level, that global level is important. The difficulty, of course, is there's no real mechanism for ensuring global supplies. I gave a talk yesterday at FAO, and they sort of said, oh, well, that's our job. Yeah, right. They don't control any budgets in agriculture ministries in any country. These are decisions that have to be made at national levels. They can be helped by the research from the International Rice Research Institute. There are global public goods that are out there, trade agreements with the WTO. All of these things can help. But in fact, all of these key decisions will have to be made at the national level, but be informed by what's happening globally. So that's the task. I think it's clear, the bottom line here. Policy issues are really different from one level to the other. And a good food policy analyst needs to understand the different policy issues, but then how are they connected? How do we get from what's going on in the world food economy? How do we get down to national level food security policy debates? And then how do we deliver and make sure households have access to the food that they need? Food security indicators. I'm going to kind of tell you, we've actually made quite a bit of progress. I doubt that you can see this. I've got the world, sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean on this diagram, and I've got three different decade periods. The average from 1990 to 92, from 2010 to 2012, and from 2014 to 2016. You might wonder, how did I get data for 2016? Oh, I made it up. No, actually, I didn't make it up. FAO made it up. But it's a forecast of what is likely to be for 2016. Over those 2 decades, 3 decades, I got 2000, 2002, we got 3 decades. The world went from an incidence of undernutrition, that is, into how many people do not get enough food energy on a regular basis. We went from an incidence of 18.6% down to 10.9%. So that's very substantial progress. Now, understand that's a 30-year horizon. 25. Okay, 25-year horizon. Sub-Saharan Africa starts, it's always been the poster child for the problem of food security. Sub-Saharan Africa starts with 33.2% incidence of undernutrition, and even Sub-Saharan Africa has made quite substantial progress. In 2014-16, the best estimate is it's going to be about 23.2%. It's a 10.0 percentage points decline, or about a 30% decline in undernutrition. Southeast Asia starts in 1990-92 at about the same level as Sub-Saharan Africa. We tend to forget just how recently Southeast Asia was a real problem child for the development community. That this region was poor, there was a lot of hunger and malnutrition, 30.6% in 1990-92. But by 2014, it had declined to 9.6%. A 21-point decline, a 69% decrease. If you wonder why I'm looking for lessons on how to end hunger, I'm looking in this region. That table is the answer. Because this region This is Southeast Asia. It doesn't even have China. This is just Southeast Asia. This region has been incredibly successful in this transformation. Okay, so what's driven this over the past 3 or 4 decades? Okay, I'll have to hurry. 3 big topics that I think we need to at least have open for discussion. First is the changing global environment in which national food systems are set. Second is the return of food price volatility. Between 1982 and 2002, food prices kept falling. They were very stable, and it looked like you could just forget about food price volatility and scarcity as the driver of your problem. You may have access issues, but you don't have to worry about volatility and supplies. So that's second. And the third, and this has really come on my intellectual horizon only in the last several years, the growth in income inequality within very important countries and across countries has changed the nature of the policy debate in fairly important ways. I think we have to be really clear that the rapid increase in income inequality that we've seen in almost all of the important countries that we look at inside each country, that growth in income inequality has not prevented quite significant declines in undernutrition, and it has led to a new focus at the national level and among the donor agencies on social safety nets. Are there ways that we can reach these poor households with food-based social safety nets, with cash, with a debit card that you can take and put wherever you want? The new information communication technologies that are out there have revolutionized what we can think about in terms of how to reach the poor with additional resources beyond what it is they're able to grow on their own farms or eke out a living in a low-paying service opportunity. Changing global. I teach a whole course on this slide, so Peter Ward heard me go on and on about it yesterday. Changing global environment, rapid economic growth in Asia, creation of hundreds of millions of households going up into the middle class with new demands for automobiles, television sets, but also demands for a different diet. There's a dietary transition that comes with this rapid economic growth. The information and communications revolution, this is important at both the household level and at the international level. The ability to communicate almost instantly transforms how efficiently markets can operate. Because markets operate on information, and the faster they can get the information, the more efficient they're going to be. It doesn't have to be in billionths of a second the way the U.S. stock market operates, but the fast transmission of information and knowledge is very important. Stock market is the point. Global financial markets have become interested in the emerging economies, not necessarily all for the good. Yes, of course, having access to cheaper sources of capital so you can build your infrastructure, that's all fine, but if the money is hot money and you're building a road with it, there's a mismatch in the time horizon that gets really scary when the money goes out, and then you can't meet your bills, and then you have to depreciate your exchange rate, and suddenly you've got a macro crisis on your hands. That's not how you get investors in these countries to take the long view they need in order to make these infrastructure and long-term investments. China starting in the 1990s, and it changed the nature of demand for basic commodities, metals, energy, coal, petroleum. Alan Greenspan in the mid-1990s is chairman of the Fed used to talk about the weightless economic growth that we saw in advanced countries. It didn't use any natural resources. It was all based on new knowledge. Silicon Valley was, okay, it needs a little bit of electricity, but basically, economic growth was not resource intensive in the rich world. But when the economic growth in the world is being driven by India and China and Brazil and Indonesia, other countries that need roads, buildings, railways, harbors, airports, rolling stock, that takes cement, copper, iron ore, steel. It takes real commodities, and it takes energy to fuel that whole expansion. So economic growth is no longer weightless, and the emergence of, especially India and China, onto the growth thing changed the nature of world commodity markets. And it's taken the whole financial community some time to get that all sorted out. High energy prices, and I note high but volatile energy prices, because I think oil's $37 a barrel now instead of $137. So we're in a commodity bust at the moment. But high energy prices for well over a decade was a game changer for agriculture. The food economy, I note that Latin America in particular responded very, very vigorously to these opportunities in terms of producing sugar-based ethanol, exporting corn and soybeans, and so on. But when energy prices are high, it makes economic sense in the marketplace to convert food commodities into liquid fuel. Gasoline, diesel. Gasoline, you can do corn from the American Midwest and run it through an ethanol plant and put that ethanol into the gas tank of a car. If we used all of the entire corn crop in the United States converted to ethanol, it would provide about 15% of our liquid fuel demand for the automobile fleet in the United States. So this is a game changer in just orders of magnitude. But what happened, of course, with high energy prices, you get high food prices, because then you can you hooked food commodities onto the energy engine. And that turned out to be very, very scary. I think we have a breathing space now, but I think we need to stop the mandates on biofuels, put some taxes on. Here's where the market is not getting it right. We're going to need informed and sensible tax policy. Climate change. I'm no expert on climate change, but I've got a lot of friends and colleagues who are, and I'm scared to death. There's real serious instability coming, problems of losing productivity, especially in areas that need the productivity growth the most, sub-Saharan Africa in particular. I'm a reasonable optimist that with appropriate government intervention planning that we can mitigate most of the damage over the next 20 or 30 years. But if we don't stop warming, all the science fiction I read as a child on how humans had to give up on the planet that they'd ruined and flew off to some other galaxy, that's all going to be too true. Price volatility, you'll remember the spikes. Do understand, we had the spikes in 2007-8. We had corn prices spike up, we had wheat prices spike up, rice got caught in it, rice prices spiked up. 2011, 2012, when wheat and corn, for different reasons, spiked, rice did not participate. Rice prices have been almost stable since 2009. It's a really important lesson in why that happened, because there was no reason why rice prices needed to go up in 2007, 2008, but they did. There was no need for them to go up in 2011 or 2012 or 2014, and they didn't. Got to be a lesson on how we made that progress. So prices can go up and down, both directions. Big debate right now. Should sharp price movements be prevented by having the government intervene and stabilize prices? Or should societies learn how to cope with the instability by using rapid payout, social safety nets, getting people to understand, it's a volatile world you live in, so increase your savings, be prepared for that. Big debate. I'm in the price stabilization school myself, but sometimes I feel like I'm alone there. There is no global governance in this arena. Governments get together at the G8 and G20 and they make nice pronouncements, but nothing happens. The ASEAN experience is really interesting. This is why the rice price has been stable. There is an ASEAN rice reserve scheme, which is completely irrelevant, has no influence whatsoever on the world rice market. But the leaders of ASEAN get together twice a year, and food security is on the agenda every single time. And let us be really clear here, the Philippines and Vietnam were bad actors in 2008, and learning to simply not scare the market. Just build up your own reserves, as Philippines and Indonesia have done. Not huge, but enough that you feel confident that you don't have to do crazy things when it looks like there might be we've got an El Nino on. We're going to lose something on the order of 2 to 3, maybe 4 million tons of rice in the region. Why haven't rice prices spiked? Because the reserves are adequate. There's enough rice out there. We're going to get through this, I think. Tomorrow I may look really foolish when prices skyrocket, but I think what's going on here is ASEAN has simply quietly agreed not to do stupid things. That's not formal. There's no newspaper headline about that, but I think that's what's going on. Okay, there's a picture of the volatility, income inequality. Let me just at least show you. This is the structural transformation for 130 years, Japan and Indonesia. And I like this picture. It took me almost 3 months to actually get the data together and put this picture together. But I like it because it shows, actually, I think 2 things. One, Japan and Indonesia are very different countries, but they're following a very similar path of structural transformation. The red line is the share of the workforce in agriculture. The blue line, and it's between 0 and 1, it's the proportion. The blue line is the share that agriculture contributes to the economy, to GDP, so it's the share of agriculture and GDP. Notice that the blue line is well below the red line. What that means is that there's a gap in productivity of agricultural labor relative to productivity of labor outside of agriculture. And if you subtract the 2 shares in a way that you get a negative number, you get the green line on the bottom, which is simply looking at the gap. That gap narrows. Eventually it goes away. But it didn't go away in the United States until 1980. This is a long historical process. And trying to fix things without understanding where you are in this process just does not work. If structural transformation fails, historically the failure has almost always been because countries did not invest enough in their agriculture and did not invest in raising productivity, especially raising productivity of their agricultural labor. The labor then gets pushed out of agriculture, goes into the urban slums, has these very, very low productivity service jobs, and then nobody knows how to do an industrial service revolution. We knew how to do an agricultural revolution. We had green revolution technology. What do you do when all that surplus labor is not on the farm? It's in urban areas at very low productivity service jobs. How do you get them into higher productivity undertakings? Is it just education? Is it investing in public health? Are we simply going to have to do social safety nets to be sure that these people survive and hope for the the future? I don't think we know the answer to this, but this is a problem for almost every country in sub-Saharan Africa, and also for the subcontinent, for India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. Okay, the political economy. I can't stop until I at least put these issues in front of you. I think that a behavioral perspective on how policymakers make their decisions is critical. There's things that we've learned now that just violate all the central assumptions of the basic neoclassical paradigm. There's loss aversion, time inconsistency, other regarding preferences, herd behavior. Herd behavior is what sets up panics in food markets. Framing decisions, how you ask the question pretty much determines what answer you're going to get. All of these regularities that we now understand from behavioral economics imply really serious welfare losses from food price instability. But the standard model of international trade shows there's welfare gains from food price instability. It's simply wrong. We can't use that model now. We have to understand the political economy from this behavioral perspective. The policy approach, the micro-macro. Understand how to link the micro-macro. Make sure that what you're doing in the short run does not cut off what you need to be doing in the long run. I understand you've got to do things in the short run to stay in office, but you can do right things and wrong things. I mean, if you've got a longer run vision of where you want to be, then it's okay to make sure you do the right things in the short run. The problem is volatile food prices, and especially the fear of food shortages and spikes, keeps policymakers worrying about the wrong thing. It's how do I cope in the short run? How do I keep people from starving when food prices spike? What's next? Well, a short list. Higher productivity for smallholder farmers, but understand not all smallholder farmers can stay on the farm. That's what the structural transformation is about. We will need somewhat larger farm size in order to increase labor productivity, and higher labor productivity is the pathway out of poverty. So we need a dynamic rural economy. We need rising real wages in rural areas, and we need to stabilize that rural economy by a concern for volatile food prices. We need to design and fund safety nets that protect the vulnerable, both from volatile environments and from chronic poverty. And then we need support for the regional as in Southeast Asia regional and the global public goods that will be absolutely essential going forward to sustain adequate food supplies, access to that food, and improved nutritional outcomes in households. So there's 3 time horizons that we're going to have to work with. We're going to have to work in the short run. For me, that's a decade. Over the next decade, we have to figure out how to maintain reasonable stability in the global food system so that we can focus our investment decisions on the bigger, longer-term issues. In the medium run, 2 to 3 decades, we're going to have to manage demand growth. I don't think that's an issue of slowing down population growth. I don't think that's where the problem is going to be. First of all, I think we need to cut back radically on biofuel production. If there's a second and third generation out there, that's fine, but we should not be taking maize or palm oil and making diesel or ethanol out of it. And I worry a little bit about the conversion of grains and soy meal into meat animal products. This region's not in bad shape. China's growing awfully fast. I think the American population would be way healthier if we cut in half the amount of red meat that we consume on average. And if we did that, we would free up grain for at least one of the 2 to 3 billion people that we're going to get added to the population of the world. So I'm I know it's awfully hard to tell people you can't have that hamburger, and especially when they haven't had one and they want one going forward as we get the middle classes going. But I do think there are significant health consequences as opposed to concerns for sustainability that are going to drive that. It's very interesting how every time we get a hamburger scare in the United States, an E. coli problem, whoa, meat consumption drops really quickly. So safety and nutrition may well be the mechanism. If we can link it then into sustainability, we may actually real progress on that. The long run, though, is I think the scary and obviously the least that we know about. The task is to manage a sustainable increase in global supplies of food, subject to all the new risks from climate change, but also subject to the fact that we've got a very depleted resource base in a lot of parts of the world, and we need to regrow forests, not keep cutting them down. They're a wonderful, important sink for carbon. So in the long run, it's the production, sustainable production, but we've got to get from here to there. Thank you very much.